Welcome to our webinar today, Research to Practice Award, using multimodal play in adult learning classrooms. I'm going to pass it over to our facilitator for today, Elisa Belzer.
Thanks, Lauren, and welcome everybody. We'll be hearing about our Research to Practice Award winner, but first I'm going to just share with you a little bit about the journal and about the award itself. Lauren, can you advance the slide? But before we do that, a little bit of housekeeping. So go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't already. Make sure you're muted. And if you're having a technical issue, just go ahead and raise your hand. Most of you are probably very familiar with Zoom at this point, but the webinar format is a little bit different than meeting. If you haven't used this in a webinar, usually we use the chat to introduce yourself, to share links, to communicate with the group. But to ask questions of either me or Rachel, our award winner, you should use the Q&A, and we'll be monitoring those questions and answering them a little bit later on. You can feel free to use either of those, either the chat or the Q&A at any time. With the Q&A, we'll get to it later. We are recording this session, and follow-up email will come with links to the recording, the slides, a certificate for your participation, and then registration links for an action research coaching workshop, which is a follow-up on this session. I'll talk more about at the end, coming up March 26th and May 14th. Okay, to get started, the Research to Practice Award is an activity of the Adult Literacy Journal, which is published by ProLiteracy. This is a peer-reviewed research journal. If you're not familiar with it, I really encourage you to look for it on the ProLiteracy website under Resources, and then click in the right-hand corner for the journal. The journal comes out 3 times a year. We have always 2 research articles. We usually have what's called a forum, which is like a discussion on a timely issue. And then we have columns about technology, about resources, about books, and sort of a summary of recent research on a topic we believe will be of interest to practitioners. And we also have a feature called Reports from the Field, which is written typically by practitioners for practitioners about promising practices. So we encourage you to look for the journal, to submit to the journal, and the journal's mission is to publish research on adult basic and secondary education and transitions to college and career programs. And I already said a little bit about what's in the journal. Please, if you have questions about the journal, I should say I'm one of the co-editors currently of the journal. You can always reach out for questions or more information, but mostly I encourage you to read the journal. The journal really places a strong emphasis on research to practice. And as part of that mission, a few years ago, I guess this is our 2nd year, ProLiteracy, through funding from Dollar General, launched an award for the best research submission of the year that emphasizes application to practice from research. So that's what we're going to hear about today, is the award winner for this past year. So congratulations to our Research to Practice Award winner, Rachael Gruen. Her paper that she'll be telling you about today is called You Don't Know What I Went Through, Adult Learners Healing Through Multimodal Play. It's a little bit hard to say that. So I want to introduce you to Rachael. Rachael is, next slide, please. Rachael is a middle school humanities teacher, but she also works with adults. She has, oops, can you go back for a sec? She has over 14 years of experience teaching across middle school kids and adults. She has a master's degree in special education and a PhD in literacy, language, and culture from the University of Illinois, Chicago. In both her teaching and research, she prioritizes a whole human approach, which you're going to see in this paper that she's going to be presenting today, ensuring that learning experiences are meaningful and transformative. Her work is rooted in action research, which she's also going to talk about what that is, and that connects very much to the workshops we're going to be offering as follow-up on this session, and participatory action research, which means well, you'll hear about it from Rachel what it means. And she emphasizes collaboration with students rather than research conducted on them. So it's research with, not on. And I think that's a great way for practitioners to learn more. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel, and she'll talk about how she learned more by doing research with learners. Rachel, congratulations, and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Elisa, for that introduction. And thank you to ProLiteracy and Dollar General for this opportunity to share the work that students and I did together. In embarking on the research together, our goal was to not only make change in our program, but to have a broader impact on adult education. So it's so wonderful to be here with so many people across the country today to talk about this work. Throughout our time together this afternoon, we'll start on the stage, kind of learning about the research we engaged in and the insights it offered on literacy instruction. We'll then take a balcony view to think about action research methodologies that can be transferred into your own setting. So to set the scene, I first need to introduce you to the cast of characters. These are all the people that engage in the research and analysis of this study. As Elisa said, this is participatory action research. So all of the students that were as doing research with were part of the research analysis as well. Our opening scene is going to focus on two individuals, me, the teacher researcher, and Gloria, a student researcher. These two individuals will be highlighted throughout, as I was hoping Gloria would be able to make it on this webinar today, but it didn't work out for that. Okay, envision this. The year is 2018. It's a typical January morning in Chicago. I close my book, onboard the train, and walk the few blocks to the Community Service Center, where I am prepared to teach adult ELA and social studies classes. I walk down the stairs into the basement, begin to take off my gloves, unfog my glasses, and center myself for class. As I look up from putting my gloves in my pocket, Gloria is standing before me. She is anxious to share the results of the language arts GED test she took on Saturday. She didn't pass. She missed the cutoff by 2 points for the 5th time in a row. She came in early because she was determined to figure out how to get her diploma. Without it, she couldn't get the promotion she deserved. As she shared this news with me, I thought of the many other students with a similar story and decided something needed to change in the way we are approaching this. To design a successful intervention for this change, I needed to know what would work best from the students who needed the diploma. I invited all participants to be active designers and researchers of this intervention, and we started by gathering insight. We did interviews, we did some photo journaling where students took photos of their lives outside of class and recorded notes about what they were doing. And I made just some observations of what students were doing in and beyond the school day to understand their literate lives outside of class and how those literacies might help them in the classroom. In the first round of this data collection, students recorded themselves making dinner, making resources for their child's learning, and making boxes to sell as an entrepreneur. In fact, Gloria made this box for me to hold notes for my soon-to-be-born son. Do you see a pattern? I was noticing that students best learned their mastered literacies in hands-on spaces that incorporated many modes of making. Since my students were so passionate about making, we're going to stop now and make something together. In the chat, Lauren is going to put a link in that will give you access to a virtual whiteboard through Canva. In this virtual whiteboard, I invite, and I really say invite intentionally because I know that sometimes we join a webinar because it's on our lunch break and it's the background and that's easy. So all forms of participation in this process is welcomed and honored, but I invite anyone willing to open that whiteboard and add elements, text, features to collaboratively compose a portrait of an adult education graduate. So I'm going to try to, oh wait, stop. This is good technology here. Let me stop sharing and share just the whiteboard to bring that up and show you a few different ways to engage in this whiteboard. So you have some elements that you can add. Those that have the crown are for like premium. We don't have the premium, but you can still add it. It will just have the little Canva design on that. You can add text. You could upload some images maybe. You could take a drawing tool.
Rachel, we're not seeing your whiteboard.
You are not. Thanks for that update. Are you seeing anything from my screen?
You're seeing your Zoom
Oh, interesting. Okay, let's try.
window.
Thank you for that. How about now?
There you go.
Okay, thank you. Great. So let's take a few minutes to just kind of collaboratively design, create, and make this vision of a graduate. I will say too, you can change the zoom in on the bottom, which sometimes makes you lose a little bit, but if we need a little bit more whiteboard space, you can zoom out a bit to add that. Yeah, and you can think about things they might be saying or thinking. Hmm. I love this. Lots of celebration, lots of joy I'm seeing. Hmm. Yeah. Growth and challenges are a part of that, identities. I love that community celebration. Hmm. Reading some of the text, people are adding, this is so much work. How am I going to get it done? I love seeing when students bring their children to their graduation. It's warming to see the kids celebrating their parents' accomplishments, planning for the future, growth targets. Yeah. Normalizing the emotions of excitement and nervousness. Both can be true. Motivations. Hmm. Take a little less than a minute to kind of add any final thoughts or images you might want to share? And as you are adding those final thoughts, I'm going to stop the timer because I don't know if it's going to ring, and I'm going to transition back to presenting the slideshow. Great. So I would love to know if anyone is willing to throw into the chat, what was it like for you to kind of play for a few minutes in this space during a webinar? Any kind of words or thoughts that came up for you? I'm going to see if I can see the chat. Energizing. Nice change. Absolutely love it. Engaging. Great. Creative instead of just listening. Interacting. Sorry, Roxanne. Yeah, right. And then there's that element too of like, it is a new tool. How do we engage with it? And then I'm also curious what kind of like modalities or semiotics did you engage with? So did you use text or image, or did you try to play with a type of font and try something different out? What were people drawn to? Both? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so experimenting with both images, some frustration that came up with it. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, so I wanted to bring this in just as making was coming up in what I saw students' literacies being outside of school. My educator kind of lens started to see a lot of overlap between making and composing, all of those things that happen, right? We have different semiotics that we compose with, different ways that we communicate, and all of those feelings of frustration and how do I do this come with that as well. So other words that emerged from the interviews that in the intake and different interviews that we did with students, I started to code, and terms such as challenging, regret, doubt, stuck, left behind, unwelcomed, overwhelmed, lost, urgency, and pressure all started to come up in some of these intake interviews that we were having with students, in questioning them about previous schooling experiences. And those words really aligned with research done in adult education around the complex relationships that adult learners have with learning. There is research that shows the aftermath of violence, neglect, and trauma that students may have experienced in their lives. With that said, there's also plenty of research out there that shows how literacy, particularly narrative storytelling, can act as a therapeutic strategy. Narrative storytelling can help students organize fragmented and chaotic emotions in order to regain a sense of control. Narrative storytelling can also help students explore and discover possible new endings. So with students gravitating towards making, and at the time of this study, a newly changed law in Illinois for alternative diploma options outside the GED test, we had more freedom to think about the type of writing or composing we did. And as a group, we decided to use multimodal play as a designed intervention in a narrative composition unit. Multimodal play stems from multiliteracies with the belief that there is a rapid and continuous process of change in the way in which we read, write, view, listen, compose, and communicate information. So just as we kind of experienced, we just played with a mode of composing. It was a new mode. For some of us, that was frustrating. We didn't know what to do. For some of us, we experimented with that. But as you can see in the pictures on this slide, modes can be magazines, images, it could be technology, it could be different materiality that students get to play with to communicate what they're trying to communicate. It's a very expansive look at literacy teaching, one that is unscripted in order to allow for participants to play with their ideas and the modal resources and materials. Research on multimodal play reveals that it has the potential to invite learners to reframe learning. It creates an environment that focuses on process over outcomes, encourages joy. Some of you brought some of those positive feelings up after our play, and it invites the imagining of possible lives. So we applied the multimodal play intervention to a 6-week narrative writing unit. Every Thursday, students entered a class with a variety of digital and non-digital materials spread out along the table. They spent 90 minutes composing and ended the class by journaling about their experience. They documented their reactions, feelings, the ways they participated, their methods of engagement, and what artifacts they had connected to their learning. Each of these sessions was also video and audio recorded. To learn about the impact of the intervention each week, I reviewed all the journal reflections alongside the transcribed video and audio data and recorded overall themes from the week. After data was collected, all researchers engaged in a similar process, using short words or phrases to describe patterns they saw in the reflections and portfolios. So as a reminder, codes from early memos included words like challenge, regret, doubt. But as participant researchers continued to look through their work during and after the intervention, new codes appeared, such as believe in yourself, take chances, life story, express yourself, one step at a time, hope, learning, emotional growth. I hope you can see, as we saw, multimodal play as an intervention began to transform students' outlook. Their feelings and reactions to the learning went from words associated more with negative emotions to words associated more with positive emotions. So once those initial codings occurred, participant researchers shared their codes with each other, discussed patterns, and kind of synthesized down to a few codes that they felt were most resonant. Power, choice, collaboration, healing, self-expression, and process. After themes were determined, I then went back into all the data and independently used those codes to do more analysis to better understand how those themes were related to one another and what that meant about the research we did. So we initially engaged in the study to inquire how multimodal play might be an alternative pathway to developing the competencies needed for a high school equivalency diploma and workforce readiness program, which it did, engaging in composition, right? They were brainstorming, they practiced organization, feedback, revision, how to reflect, and then doing the research, how to ask questions, how to make meaningful insight. But the analysis and the reflection really reminded me that the classroom's purpose is more than a high school diploma. It is a place for adult learners to have agency and make connections, a place that can provide joy and healing. So this study isn't reporting out on the success of the test scores after implementing this intervention, but instead I'm focusing on the social emotional competencies that came out of this study, things that I believe help develop real-world competencies and lifelong learners. Multimodal play gave control to students to choose the content and mode of what they wanted to compose. Multimodal play increased opportunities for students to connect with their peers. And because of that agency and those connections, students began to reframe their relationship to school and academic spaces. I recognize that as an educator, time is always something we have to contend with. It feels particularly salient when modern forces and policies such as standardized testing, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, dictate program success and funding on test scores. And Students are coming to us with that kind of goal in mind, right? They want that diploma. And so it feels really important that we make sure that we are taking steps towards that. So creating space for these unscripted moments of play may seem unreasonable, but I also can't ignore the impact of this study. While we can't assume that adult learners have experienced trauma, we also can't deny that throughout, especially these past few years, with a worldwide pandemic and local socio-political unrest, many adults have experienced pain, loss, and fear, increased social isolation, and mental health challenges. So because of this study, as an educator, I am regularly reflecting on what modal materials I have available for students to use during their work time. Things that you see in this picture, right? Popsicle sticks, construction paper. What might I add? Beads, to make it just a little bit different to ignite some of that play. I also consider how I create small and large moments of unscripted work time, similar to what we experienced on Canva, right? 5 minutes. Let's see what we come up with. How can we kind of engage in some play in that way? Both of those, offering different modes and unscripted moments, offer students control. And then I also think about how am I creating opportunities for students to connect. Maybe it's in the way that the room is set up. So I tried to really intentionally bring all the tables together because as they were asking for materials across, they were looking at what other students were engaging in. They were asking each other questions about what they were doing. They were learning from each other. Or in ways that I'm intentionally prompting and thinking about moments for sharing in the lesson to allow for that connection. So those were the big takeaways I got out of the study that we did together as students and myself. I would like you to take a minute to consider your own practice. What is one takeaway from this research that you think that you might think more about or apply to your practice? And I invite you to type it in the chat as it comes to your mind. Story time. Mm-hmm. Mm, wonderful. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna let these just kind of sit in the chat. We will bring them back up at the end when we engage in our discussion, but continue to feel free to add those as they come up or as you're thinking about them. Maybe another person's response is igniting an idea in your mind. So I really like this quote from Action Research. No research without action, which is what we kind of just reflected on, and then no action without research. So it is quite possible that this particular research study doesn't directly relate to your students or an issue you are having at your site. So now we're going to kind of take a balcony view of the research to talk more about what the process was and what it could be in your space. I'm going to continue to invite you and all the brilliant minds in the space to share your thoughts using the chat so that we can kind of build those connections across and build consensus or just creative ideas that spark one another. So action research is a systematic method of data collection and analysis to affect change. Step one, then, of action research is to identify an issue or something you want to change. I identified my issue from a frustration a student expressed, right? Gloria kept going and taking the test, and it was just the one test, and something wasn't working. But an issue could be anything you see or experience. It could be a question you have about the future. It could be something you are interested in exploring more, something you hope to change. Think about an issue, a challenge, an interest, a curiosity, worth researching in your own practice and throw it in the chat. It might just spark an idea for another person. So I know one thing that I am thinking about right now is the use of AI and what it means for writing and feedback. So it could be as general as that. It could be something more specific. Mhm. Yeah, the use of narrative. Resources. Yeah. I love that you're already thinking about that next step of intervention. Yeah. And this challenge or frustration or question can be, very unrelated to anything mentioned here, like something that's specific at your site as well. But that is the kind of the first step of action research, to think about, identify that issue. And then central to action research, particularly participatory action research, which I did where students are a part of every step of that, is the idea that you start the study of the design action with a recognition and observation of human action as it exists. So who are the people you are working with to do this intervention? In designing intervention, I thought about the different ways I could gain insights into the students. Many of these methods you are probably already doing. So I worked with our manager to specify some questions on the intake survey that I wanted to know. I thought about transition times like lunch, where I might just be in conversation and community with students to learn more about their lives. In the classroom, what are some specific writing prompts that students could answer where they're practicing skills but also giving insight? Photo shares, having them take some photos of things that they're doing outside of class and using those as storytelling to learn more about them outside of class. And then surveys and others. If there's anything else people have done to really get to know their students, feel free to share it in the chat. The important part of this step is, what do you want to know? Who do you want to ask? And how you kind of document and think about those answers. So things we're already doing is just adding another layer of intentionality to it. Similar to getting to know your students as educators, you're probably constantly collecting data. In this process, we're just formalizing it a bit more. So you want to be strategic about what you want to collect and why, who you want to collect it from, and how often you want to collect it, and then how you'll kind of systematically manage that data. So I had my digital lesson plans to kind of think about, what was I doing? How was I creating the space? I had personal lesson reflections that I collected. As I mentioned, we did video and audio recordings of specific class periods, those that we had the unscripted moments of composing. The students also did reflections, and so I had those just as digital journals for students in a Google Doc that they continually added to, so I wasn't trying to manage a bunch of different files. And I really appreciated having it digitally, because then I could kind of copy and paste or some of the trends, or as I was coding, highlight and manipulate some of that information as we were going. So students would add their thoughts and reflections there. If they wanted to add an artifact that showed some learning or something that they created, they could take a picture of it and upload it to that document really easily. And that was just like a really nice way to create, gather a lot of data in a cohesive and systematic way. You also, as educators, are constantly analyzing student work during and after a unit. You're thinking about who is doing what did they learn, what did they miss? Data analysis is no different. For data analysis in this study, students and I used what's called constant comparison analysis. So meaning we would regularly read through reflections and artifacts to look for trends in words that were used. Was there trends in affect or any kind of emotions that were reflected upon? Were there trends in learning? And we looked for these across everything. We then created umbrella terms for those trends, which were used as a lens to determine the significance as we continue to analyze. So those terms that I read out prior, right? Hope, that was an umbrella term from things that we read in the student reflections that we saw across multiple pieces of reflection. And then the goal of action research is to implement a change. It's also very common for action research to evolve. So as I mentioned, like we were thinking, what are the high school equivalency competencies that are going to happen? And it moved into what are kind of the therapeutic healing tools that this intervention allows. So it's very common for action research to evolve. And that's why it's so important to take the time to reflect on what has been learned. So that's kind of like a quick overview of both the research that I did and some action research. And I want to make sure that there's time, because I saw some different questions come up in the chat. I want to make sure that there's time for us to engage in some discussion. So I'm going to turn it back over to Elisa now, who will lead us in some discussion, as well as think about next steps of how you might apply and engage in action research in your own environment.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It was really wonderful to get a little window into your practice and to hear about your study, and also for you to so helpfully describe what an action research process is like. So we're going to give a few minutes for people to ask you questions, both about your study specifically and about engaging in action research more generally. And then for those of you, just to know what's coming up, we'll take a few minutes at the end for me to talk about an opportunity that I'm going to be leading with a couple of practitioners in supporting you possibly in engaging in an action research project over this spring. So, but before we get to that, we want to give everyone an opportunity to interact directly with Rachel. So I just put a few discussion questions up here. You don't have to follow these questions or in any particular order, but I thought it would be helpful if you have an opportunity to ask questions of Rachel about her findings or her process, what really stood out for you as interesting, and also what stands out for you about doing what was interesting about her findings, and also what stands out for you about the possibility of using action research to inform and improve your practice. So you can type your questions into the chat or the Q&A, or yeah, I guess those are our two options. So I think I already saw a question in the chat. Lauren, are you monitoring that? Well, I'll go with the first question at the bottom, but I think there was one further up. So Rachel, Steve asks, how much extra time did your project require?
Wow, that's such a good question. You know, as I mentioned, I think it wasn't necessarily about extra time, but a difference in intention in how I was spending my time. So, and yes, there was a little bit of extra time. So I had some more specialized interviews that I did with students that what I would maybe did 30 minutes a couple times throughout the 6 weeks. So maybe once at the beginning, once at the end, once in the middle, once at the end. So that 30 minutes transcribing is pretty tricky, but that is not necessarily, and I think at least we'll go through this more with action research, isn't necessarily something you have to do if you want to do video or audio recording. I think there's a lot of data that you can get from student artifacts, their work, as well as some reflections, which is something you're probably looking at anyway. It's just thinking about what is the lens you're looking at it with, what is the kind of question or trends that you're hoping to see from that. So it can be as much extra time as you're hoping to put in it. I think it's more of just the intention of how you're using that time.
I think that's a great answer, and you can sort of scale up and scale down based on what you have, right? I think asking a question and trying to look systematically at it, trying something new is such a big step that even if you can do that, that's great, right? Rachel, there's a question here. Well, it's not exactly a question, but it's a statement. I'm a bit unclear on examples of multimodal activities that would be used. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I said, we kind of had this open composing space. And we wanted it to be narrative to kind of engage in that storytelling form. So, the easiest place for me was to bring in construction paper, glue, scissors, magazines, right? Like those were pretty easy modalities because then you can start to use not only words but images. Some people really gravitated towards that. My paper talks a little bit too about like some of our narratives are hard to express in words, particularly if they hold trauma or sensitive topics. And so being able to express them in images was really helpful. Another practice was embodied ways. So one student kind of used their narrative and acted it out more, right? So there wasn't necessarily a tangible story that they were writing or turning in, but we caught via the video recording, started to create characters and have people help talk through that story and act it out. So there's kind of like this embodied modality of storytelling. There's digital storytelling. Some people chose to kind of create a podcast, which is strictly audio, and think about storytelling in that way. So it's different ways that you can communicate through materiality, I would say.
And we have another question. Was it difficult to locate relevant research for your project, or did you? In what ways did you use research? Maybe I'll add on to the question that was posed.
Yeah, I think anytime I try to find relevant, uh, I did find relevant research. It was difficult, and this is what makes it meaningful, right? It was difficult to find research in adult education around play. And so I talk about that a little bit. Like play is predominantly researched and studied in younger children, particularly because play doesn't happen a lot as we get older for those time constraints that I talked about. But that's part of what you are adding your research to. I found there was a lot of relevant and research, and Lauren has a resource page that she'll be sharing out as well that I used around action research in general and different spaces that people use action research. And there's a lot of different kind of terms that are similar. So there's participatory action research, there's inquiry practice. And so I shared a few different resources around that Elisa can then walk you all through as well. Yeah, I think ProLiteracy is a phenomenal space to get a lot of relevant research and um and be open-minded about looking at relevant research in spaces that maybe aren't adult and how they can be applied and what that lens might be.
Thank you. And I think it's also important to note that your design was very heavily informed by the learners, not by necessarily by external research, right? One way to go is to design a new practice based on what the research tells us is good practice. Another is to design based on what learners tell us is good practice. Hopefully they're similar, but they aren't always, and there isn't always research on exactly what you want, what you see the problem to be. So there's really two kind of important sources to inform you. Does anyone else have any other questions before we move on? Are there any in the Q&A, Lauren?
Nope, I don't see any other
Okay.
questions.
All right, I think we'll move on. Rachel, again, congratulations. I can see why the paper was awarded the prize. I think it's just so rich, both in terms of what you learned from your students by engaging in action research, and also what the potential of action research is to inform our practice more generally. So on that note, we're going to go on to the next slide, and I'm going to talk about an opportunity that is available for everybody here and also for everyone in the ProLiteracy broader community. Following up on the value of action research, I will, along with a couple of practitioners who worked with me last year in a group where I facilitated a collaborative action research group, we're going to offer 2 coaching workshops where you can learn more about action research as a way to inform and improve your practice. And both of these sessions will be workshops, not webinars. They will be almost completely interactive. So this is not just a turn on a webinar kind of session. This is a kind of hands-on and working together to identify, as Rachael explained, like what is your challenge, your interest, your issue that you want to explore, and how to move towards something you want to try out as a result, whether it is informed by your students or research or both, and then engaging in that process. And learning from it and developing implications. So the first seminar will kind of focus largely on the first half of the process, identifying an action research topic or question, and how to design something you want to try, an innovation, a new practice, and then kind of getting started. And the second session will focus largely on what do you do with the stuff that you collect. And I think it's really important to note that this will be kind of like a quick introduction and giving you a taste. But I think it could be enough to get you started on thinking about this as a way of general practice that can help you improve your cycle in cycles. Action research isn't something you're necessarily doing every minute of every class time, but it is something that you kind of build into your class time, do it for a while, and then at some point later on, maybe engage in another cycle that's either based on what you learned from the first cycle or is just a new, fresh cycle where you are taking on an interest or challenge. So we hope that you will register. You are more than welcome to invite colleagues from your place where you teach, which I think is an awesome way to kind of have a built-in accountability buddy. You see the meetings are about 6 weeks apart, and the idea is after the first meeting, you'll be trying stuff out, and then we'll come back to the second meeting, and hopefully people will have experiences to share, as well as questions and troubleshooting and next steps and all that kind of thing. So it's really an opportunity to engage in sort of like a 2-session professional development, both to support your understanding and ability to implement action research and to hone in on a specific area you'd like to work on, importantly in community with others. So come by yourself, come with others, meet people in the session. I think you'll get a lot out of it. I will be, like I said, I'll be facilitating with the help of other practitioners. So before we close off, I'm wondering if anyone has any questions about what would be involved and, should you or shouldn't you, and what are the expectations? And also just, are you interested, and what makes you interested about doing this? So I think in particular, also, you could go back to things you said you thought you might want to try based on what you heard in the session, or what Rachael's paper kind of stirred up for you. This would be a great place to kind of get a little help in not just having this nice idea while we're all together, but actually following up on it. So does anyone have any questions you'd like to ask? I can just tell you this is a very low risk, but hopefully high reward kind of professional development. And I hope you'll consider going ahead and signing up today. You don't absolutely have to commit to both sessions, but I think you'll get more out of it if you do if you can. I don't know, we might consider recording it, but I don't think it would be the same as if you could actually come because it will be very interactive. Okay, so all levels of experience are welcome, absolutely. Should we prepare anything to have as far as information for the meeting? I think I would just encourage people to come with having given some thought to an area you're interested in looking more closely at, or improving or trying something new. But even that, you might not have had time to think about it, and we'll take time in the session. Are these workshops going to be set up similarly, or would we benefit from registering from both? I think I might have answered that, but I'll say it again. They are different. So the first session, like I said, will kind of support the first half of the action research process, and the second session will support the second half. So you could come to either one, but I would really encourage both. But, you know, if you can't do both, come to one or the other. Are there other questions? Just think about how cool Rachel's work was, and don't be discouraged by what looks like a lot of work. Because as we said before, you can do as much or as little as you have time for. I can tell you, when I was a practitioner many years ago, I just had students journal at the end of every class about what stood out for them about class, what they noticed about their own learning. And then I had those journals. We didn't do it, it was on paper. We didn't have digital back in the dark ages when I was doing this. But then they had data about their own learning over time, and I had data looking across their journal articles, and I mean their journal entries. And I also journaled at the exact same time they did, so that I could sort of be putting my reflections down right then and there when it was fresh, and also it didn't take any extra time. It was good for all of us. So even something like that could be a step, a start. So if there are any further questions about the journal, about this opportunity, you can write to the journal email address. I'm going to also put my email address in the chat, because that would be a better place to write questions about this opportunity. The ALE journal, that's the Adult Literacy Education Journal, email address there is more about the journal. There's my address. So if questions occur to you later, feel free to shoot me an email, but I hope to see many of you at our first session at the end of March. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Rachel to close, I mean to Lauren, sorry, Rachel, to Lauren to close us out.
Great. Thank you, Eliza, and thank you, Rachel, for sharing that amazing research. I think there's so much that we can take away, both big and small, that can inspire us to put this into practice in our own classrooms. And I look forward to hearing what people do with what they've learned today. And I thank you for sharing with us. Rachel will be receiving her award very soon, along with her cash prize for winning. So maybe this inspires future research from you that can be published in our journal and qualify you for future awards like this from Dollar General. We're very grateful. So thank you everyone for joining us today. If you have questions, feel free to reach out, and we hope to see you at a future webinar. Thank you.